presentation. You should now be seeing. Okay, so before we actually start out, with the content, a few session rules. And the first would be to mute your microphone when you're not speaking, so as to avoid disturbances. I would prefer it if you could keep your cameras on, because for me, that will make the session feel a bit more interactive and personal, rather than speaking to a black screen all the time. There's plenty of time during the session for your questions, your feedback, your ideas. So we would like to ask you to initially type these questions or comments in the chat, and then we will come back to them later when we have a Q&A session or a group discussion. And only if there's something that's really urgent, that really needs to be resolved right away, you can use the option offered by Teams to raise your virtual hand, and then I will be informed by my colleagues, and maybe we can address this immediately. So thank you for following these guidelines, and hopefully these will make it easier for us to keep the session run smoothly. A few words about me. My name is Mark Pluimakers. This is what I look like when I'm presenting in public, really in public and not from behind a computer screen. And in my day job, I am the head of the Research Center for International Relationship Management at Zuid University of Applied Sciences. And at the Research Center, we have two main research lines, and one of them is the application of artificial intelligence in business communication. Now, I realize that this may sound quite broad, and it is actually quite broad because it includes topics like machine translation that we've done research into. I've also been involved, and this was a project that Peter was earlier referring to, together with a colleague in the early stages of the so-called virtual senior agent, which was a support system for human service agents that help them in finding relevant information quickly on the basis of speech-to-text input. But of course, today we're going to focus at the topic of chatbots, and the research I've done in this field I've done mainly together with Michelle van Pinkster, who I think is also present, and Jos Lemming from Maastricht University. So before we actually start, I would like to point out first that we're going to, let's say, group together a lot of different things that go by different names. So if you talk about chatbots, you always see these different terms emerging, things like digital assistants, virtual agents, conversational agents. There's, of course, also the distinction between text-based and voice-activated. But for the session today, as Peter also said, is let's say introductory in nature, and we see it as the first step towards co-creating new ideas together. We're going to focus on, let's say, conversational AI in the broadest sense of the term. And this is not to say that the differences between, for example, voice and text are not relevant, but this is maybe something we can further explore in the follow-up session. So the schedule for today, very briefly, I think you've seen this also in the announcement that you received, consists of two presentations indicated here in by the orange lines, short presentations, 20 minutes, in which we share some of our recent research results, and also two time slots in which we will discuss the implications together. We will discuss your experiences. And when I looked at the list of participants yesterday, I saw that there's a lot of different areas of expertise involved. So there are people from companies who may have experimented with chatbots. There are fellow researchers from different institutions. There are IT consultants, developers. So hopefully that will lead to a very fruitful and multidisciplinary discussion later on. Just to set the stage, I want to present a brief timeline of what we call conversational AI, to also show why we organized this session, next to the things that Peter was already indicating. So if you look at the timeline of conversational AI, it really starts in 1950 when Alan Turing formulated the famous Turing test. And the interesting thing about the Turing test, at least from my perspective, is that Turing wasn't that much interested in conversational AI per se, but he used conversational abilities to, let's say, judge the state of the art in artificial intelligence. So he used conversational abilities to say, okay, we can only say that AI has succeeded if a computer is able to fool at least some human beings into thinking it is also a human rather than a computer. Now, from that starting point on, it took quite some time for the first chatbot to emerge that got some media attention, and that was Eliza in 1966. And Eliza was created, well, more or less as a joke, or at least in order to mock the typical, let's say, conversational techniques used by psychiatrists. So what Eliza would do if you spoke to her generally is that she would more or less rephrase the question or ask, very generic follow-up questions, and that was just to show that, well, actually, the conversational abilities are still fairly limited, and this is what it would look like. So it's very basic, and the conversations were quite a lot of input from the user side, and then very generic replies and follow-up questions by Eliza. Now, remarkably, even in this very simple implementation, we could see that some users were actually quite happy to use it, and they actually saw some therapeutic value in it. So that was more or less an unintended side effect of Eliza. But what fewer people know is that, let's say, 6 years before Eliza, IBM had already been experimenting with a tool that they called Shoebox that was able to recognize, let's say, 14, 15 different commands and 9 digits, and could therefore be used to provide commands to a computer. Now, what we see in those early years is there's always quite a lot of time between, let's say, the development of chatbots that get some media coverage. That was my criterion for including them. And that changed not until, let's say, 1990, when the so-called Loebner Prize was created, which offered incentives to developers. They could win prize money by creating chatbots that were human-like. And the Loebner Prize is still held annually, and it has really stimulated developers to look into ways of building chatbots that can interact with humans in a very natural way. And some famous winners include Alice, Eugene Goostman, and Mitsuko. Eugene Goostman is interesting, I think, to mention, because 13 years, I think, after winning the Loebner Prize, it was also claimed to have passed the Turing test by fooling 30% of the human judges who thought that they were actually speaking to a human rather than a computer. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether that actually counts as passing the test or not. I don't want to go into too much detail, but at least you can see the advantage, the advances there. And then you could say, let's say from 2006 onwards, the larger technical corporations started getting involved in conversational AI as well, starting with Watson, created by IBM, which was able to win Jeopardy. First version of Siri launched in 2010. Google Now, Alexa, Cortana, Google Home. So there you could really see the large players. But what's important to realize is that, let's say, in the slipstream of these large corporations, there were also a lot of, let's say, smaller companies, or companies big and small, who were starting to experiment with chatbots or other forms of conversational AI. And there were many reasons for them to do so. And a few of those are shown in this picture here. Of course, the big advantage of chatbots is that you can make them available 24/7. If they handle the tasks well, in that case, they might improve customer satisfaction. They might also cut costs if they can handle questions that are, let's say, very simple and very straightforward, and also not really challenging for a human employee to solve. So, if implemented well, they could ultimately also increase the customer engagement. On the other hand, what many companies who were experimenting with chatbots were also experiencing was that the reality from the perspective of the user was not yet optimal in many cases. So many users who were also looking into the possibilities of these chatbots found that the conversations were often awkward, to even outright awful, as is suggested in this article that appeared some time ago in the Guardian. So that's where you see that you have a promise on the one hand, you have a reality on the other, and for many companies, this has also led to let's say some doubts or some reservations as to as how they should continue there. And Gartner even predicted that for approximately 40% of first-generation chatbots or virtual assistants developed in 2018 will have been abandoned by 2020. So instead of scaling up, some companies are also giving up, or at least saying, we don't know whether we want to continue or how we want to continue. And that was for us one of the main reasons also for organizing this session, to get some input from the industry, from the experts, as to the sort of things, the sort of steps that need to be taken to take chatbots or conversational AI to the next level. Now, one of the companies that is also, let's say, more or less struggling with the promise versus the reality is a hospitality company from Maastricht called Twin Peaks. They own 2 hotels in Maastricht and a restaurant called Harry's. You may be familiar with it. And one of the owners of Twin Peaks, Jean-Marc Beaumont, who you can see now, approached us also with an assignment saying, okay, we really want to explore how to move on from here. They also experimented with a chatbot, were not entirely happy with the results, but they still saw certain degree of promise. And they approached us with the assignment, and then we asked a group of hotel management students, so the hotel management school from Zuid University of Applied Sciences. We asked a group of students to delve into this topic, and that's actually what they're going to talk about today. But before we listen to their presentation, I would briefly like to show you this video recorded by Jean-Marc Beaumont, in which he explains the reason for giving the assignment and also the reason for recruiting or working with hotel management school students. I hope it's audible. If not, you can still turn up the volume. I think mine is already maxed out, so hopefully that works. So let's listen to Jean-Marc Beaumont. I hear people or see people nodding no. Let's try again.
Hi everyone, my name is Jean-Marc Beaumont. I am the co-owner of Twin Peaks Hospitality. We have 2 hotels and a restaurant in the hotel management school for quite some while now. And what is really interesting about working with them in general is that we as hoteliers and owners are often very caught up in the daily operations and are just quite too busy to take a step back and really delve into issues and topics that are actually quite interesting and relevant, let alone research them and back them up with scientific evidence. What is particularly interesting about the subject of AI in this case is that when we first came together in January, I was quite skeptical about the subject. We had experimented with a chatbot in earlier 2019 unsuccessfully. And we really believe that human interaction and human connection is at the core of what hospitality is all about. And we were really still searching for how technology would fit in within that space. Now, obviously, we're a couple of months further and the world has changed, and stuff that we at first wouldn't even consider doing like self-check-in or having QR codes as opposed to print in our rooms when it comes to hotel info or city info, are now actually a no-brainer from a safety standpoint of view, from a market demand standpoint of view, from a standpoint of view that as we are looking at very low occupancy rates for quite some time, we're really looking at technology to enhance and make our processes more efficiently so that we can cut costs in an effective manner. So AI has become really relevant. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to assist and support you guys in the past couple of months as we were all going into quarantine, but I'm really looking forward to the results and what it can mean for us in practice.
Okay. So Jean-Marc is curious about the results, and of course so are we. And the nice thing about today's session is that we'll be able to give you a scoop that you're going to hear about these results pretty early. The project has just been finished, and they will be presented by two of the students who were part of the group who investigated this issue for Twin Peaks, Rufei Li and Stella Rappenhagen, who are joining us from abroad because they also went into quarantine during the project, and they went back home for that. So without further ado, Rufei and Stella, I would like to give the floor to you and ask you to share your insights and results with us.
Yes, can everybody see my screen? Yes. Okay, perfect. Then let me start. Well, thank you, Mr. Pleymakers. Rufei and I are delighted to be here today to share our insights about our artificial intelligence findings. As we are part of the Hotel Management School Maastricht, we mostly focused about artificial intelligence possibilities within the hospitality industry. However, all our findings are very, very generalizable, so they can be used in many different companies. And we will also focus about chatbots throughout our presentation. So just to give you a short overview about the topics that we will be discussing, we will talk about the aim of our research project, our two management questions that we have formulated to direct to both our target groups, IRM and Twin Peaks Hospitality, why we're here at the webinar, and our creation of the conceptual model and all our findings that we have found over the past couple of months. So just to start off, we created a conceptual model. This model will be presented to you in the next couple of slides. Our conceptual model was divided into three different parts. The first part of the model concentrated on all the variables that should be taken into consideration when implementing an AI from the owner's perspective. The middle part of the conceptual model was all the variables that need to be considered for the staff part. And the third part was only for guests, and this is the one that we will show you later on. This is because our main focus of the research was to focus on guest interaction. Therefore, we only focused on those variables for the time being. Secondly, we also provided a list of many different AI possibilities that we then handed over to IRM, which they can then use for all other generalizable companies. And lastly, we made an attribute model, and this is basically a model which weighs the AI possibilities from 1 till 5, 1 being the least valuable and 5 being the most valuable to the company, which we will show you later on as well. As previously mentioned, we have two different target groups. So the first management question that you see was related to IRM. And the second one was for Twin Peaks Hospitality. So why we're here today? We want to share with you all our findings and also possibly clarify some of the insights that you possibly already know. So as you can see at the bottom, this is part of our attribute model. A chatbot for us was a very interesting topic. And when making the different categories, we decided that it should fit in the category non-physical textual interaction robot. This is because chatbots usually are not physical, and they usually interact through text. As you can see, the values are relatively low. They're rated at 2 and 3 on the properties. This is because the scalability of this specific property was relatively low. By scalability, we mean the surface area. Since it only has 2 hotels and 1 restaurant, it was very difficult for the chatbot to learn, and therefore the speed of adjustment was a lot slower. Whereas for bigger companies, if we look at the hospitality side, it's more, if you look at Hilton or Marriott, the chances that a chatbot can learn faster are a lot easier. So there is a lot of potential for chatbots in the upcoming future. So this is the third part of the conceptual model, which I mentioned before is part of the guess part. We have highlighted 5 different variables, as you can see with orange. These are anthropomorphism, perceived value, information sharing, willingness, and attitude. We have highlighted these 5 different variables because these were believed to be the 5 most important ones that we have discovered through our literature studies. We also conducted interviews with experts on AI, and also hotel managers who have already implemented with AI, or also hotel managers who would like to implement AI. And these are the variables that they always mentioned that should be considered. Nevertheless, saying that, the other variables that are also in this conceptual model should also be taken into consideration. They are still of a lot of importance. However, the other 5 are a lot more important. So we gathered information by doing an online survey in order to attract as many different nationalities and age groups as possible. As through our literature study, we found out that age was a major variable that needs to be considered when implementing some sort of AI. So we used 3 different platforms. This was Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We thought that these were the 3 best platforms to use, as previously mentioned, because we wanted to get a bigger range of age groups. And we also used our star classifications of hotels, because it was believed to say that depending on the hotel, it would depend on whether people are willing to see some sort of AI application or not. And also nationality played a major role, since some nationalities, as the Asian culture, is already very open to using AI, whereas other cultures are not. And we wanted to see if that really did play a major role. So I will give the floor to Rufai, who will explain all our results that we have received through our online survey.
Okay, hello everyone, I'm Rufai, and I'll continue the presentation. As Stella showed a few slides ago about our conceptual model, that we found that information sharing and perceived value are important and have a direct link to guest willingness in using AI service. So we have imposed this question to see how our respondents of our own survey perceive the different advantages that could be possibly bring by AI service. As you can see that we have come up with 4 different statements, and I marked it into 2 different colors for time-saving and personalized service, and people tend to have a more neutral attitude towards these 2 advantages, whereas for providing information and making their life easier, that people have a more positive attitude and they believe it's a very positive thing that could be brought by AI service. And we can move on to the next slides. And as we see during our research, we found there are actually a lot of AI applications which is in practice at this moment in the hospitality industry. I want to see whether these applications really influence the interaction between the hotel guests and the hotel. And so we have posed the question, in what way the AI service did influence the communication process between the hotel guests and the hotel? And we found it's interesting that there are 3 applications that people have a very positive attitude towards, which you can see on the left side of the table: the in-room technology, translator app, and mobile check-in. And on the right-hand side, we can see these are the applications that people tend to have a more neutral attitude towards. And you can see that also online chatbot is within the list. And as we have used a 5-point scale rating scale, and in the next slide, we can see that, as Stella already mentioned, we have used different demographic information of the guests, and we want to see if these factors can influence the guest attitude to some extent. And we can see that for mobile check-in, there is a significant difference across different age groups. As you see that the people from the younger generation, in this case 18 to 24, that they have a more positive attitude towards mobile check-in. And whereas the people from the age group above 45 years old, they tend to have a more neutral attitude towards mobile check-in. And for online chatbot especially, that we also find age is a very significant factor that will influence the attitude towards using it. And we see that the younger people have a more positive attitude, whereas the people from the age group older than 45 years old, they tend to have more negative attitude towards online chatbots. And it's also interesting that for personalized recommendations, we see that people who stay in a higher hotel star classification hotel, that they have a more positive attitude towards the personalized recommendation, that they really think these service would positively contribute to the communication process. And whereas you see the people who stay in the, can we go back to, yeah, and where you can see that people from the people who stay in the lower hotel level, that they tend to have a more neutral attitude towards this, as they believe they are receiving not a food service in the hotel, then they prefer to do things by themselves. And yeah, and in this case, personalized recommendation is not that important for them. And we'll move on to the next slide. Okay. As what we mentioned in the conceptual model, we believe that the guest attitude has a direct link to the guest willingness. So we have posed a question to measure guest attitude towards AI. As you can see here, we have 4 statements, where you can see the first statement that people tend to have a more positive attitude. As you see, most of the score are over 3.5. Whereas the last statement, I would prefer talking to a robot receptionist instead of talking to an actual human receptionist. People have a very negative attitude towards it. So in this case, people, when they're arriving to a hotel, that they still prefer to talk with an actual human receptionist. We'll move on to the next slide. As I mentioned, we found the age group is a very significant factor in many cases. So we want to see whether this guest attitude also can be modified by age group. And you can see that in most of the statements, that the younger people still have a more positive attitude than the older generation. Whereas you see the third statement, I take the advice about using technology from people who are important to me, that actually people from the age group above 45 years old tend to have a more positive attitude towards this. So we believe that it also requires more further investigations on this topic to see whether age is always an important factor when you're investigating the topic of AI. And we move on to the next slide. Yes, as I mentioned, based on the literature study, we found there is a positive relationship between guest attitude to guest willingness. So we really want to see if it's really also applicable to the hotel industry. So we have done a correlational test between these 2 variables. And as you can see that from the scatter plot, there is a positive relationship between these 2 variables. And we found the coefficient is at 0.38. So it's a rather positive relationship. So we can see if the guest attitude towards AI is higher, and then their willingness in using AI also goes higher. Okay. And throughout our literature study and our research, we found that entrepreneurship really play an important role in guest willingness in using AI. And by entrepreneurship, we mean how a robot would resemble to a human. In our research specifically, we want to focus on the presence of the robot. So as you can see on the screen, we have designed 2 different robot image. And as you can see on the left-hand side, we have Harris, which believe we designed it in a more higher in entrepreneurship. And on the right-hand side, we have Ben, which is more mechanical look like, and it's lower in entrepreneurship. And we have proposed 8 different scenarios in the guest journey, and we want to see that if the entrepreneurship really play a big role. And as you can see there in the graph, that in most of the cases, people prefer Harris over Ben, which is as what we thought beforehand. However, in the first case, making reservation, and the last case, answer question when call reception, we see that people actually prefer Ben over Harris. And we thought it could be the reason that we have designed a screen on Ben, whereas Harris does not have one. So it might cause the inconsistency in terms of our results. Okay. And as Stella already mentioned, our research is focused on guest interaction in hospitality industry in terms of AI. However, we believe that our findings can be generalized for any AI applications, in this case, a chatbot. And we have found a few limitations and recommendations for implementation when a company deciding to implement an AI system, or in this case, a chatbot. And the limitation would be that we found because our client has a relatively small scale hotel, the initial acquisition cost for a chatbot is rather expensive, and it takes a lot of time to earn the money back. So we recommend them to really consider whether the ROI would be high for them. And also we found the technology readiness of the target group of the hotel is also very important. So before the implementing an AI, that they should have considered this important factors. And for recommendations, we have 4 different points. And first of all, we have entrepreneurship. And as we explained it before, the entrepreneurship really important when you're implementing an AI system. So for a company who trying to implement chatbot, we also recommend them to look into the variable entrepreneurship. And also in a few slides before that, we see that information sharing is very important for people when they're considering using an AI service. So this is also very important. Also guest attitude and also demographics. As you can see in most of our findings, that the age plays an important role into different variables. So we really recommend the company should look into different demographic variables that could have an impact on AI. Okay, and this is the end of the presentation, and we appreciate your attention. Do you have any questions so far?
Okay, thank you very much, Stella and Rufai. If anyone has a question or a comment to make in response to this presentation, you can either raise your hand like this, or you can type it in the chat. So any comments or questions? Oscar, you have a question, please.
First of all, thank you, Rufai and Stella, very much for this research. It's I'm a creator of also conversational AIs, and it's very useful for me to see this kind of research being done on what actually people want. And I really want to ask you for your own opinion that you developed through doing this research on what is it that people actually need. You know, Henry Ford said that if he asked people what they wanted, they would have told him faster horses. So doing service is great because we discover what people want. But in your own opinion, based on what you have seen, what do you think is it that people need, and is it any different from what they say that they want?
Very good question. I think it also depends indeed on the property, as we have discovered through our research. Since we are from the hotel school, we mainly focused it on hotels, but I think it depends on what kind of company you are. If you're already a very high-tech company, I'm sure that people would be very open to using AI because that's what they know. Whereas if it's a company that has only been used to human interaction and then has to change their whole lifestyle, for them it would depend on how their training is from their company, how their competitive psychological environment is. Would that mean if I implement, for example, a chatbot, am I going to lose my job? Yes or no? So that would then have to be explained from the company from beginning. And I think that training and that concept would be the most important in order to satisfy your employees and to ensure that their job is still safe, but could be enhanced with the influence of some AI application.
Okay, thanks. There's another question in the chat asked by Rick, and I'm going to read it out loud. Maybe you can see it yourself as well. Did you look into the business cases behind it as well? Implementation cost versus expected usage of clients. So that's another question I would like you to answer.
Rufai, would you like to do this one, or?
Yeah, let me think. Do you have any idea? Maybe you can go first.
I think it has to do with perhaps the first part of your conceptual model as well.
Yeah.
Where you really looked into things like implementation cost and development and return on investment.
Yeah. Actually, we have in the upper part of a conceptual model, we have the total cost of ownership as an important variables, which we also include different variables. For example, the scalability. So, for example, the size of the hotel and the hotel resources, how they're able to implement the AI application, and also is their cash flow strong enough to support the implementation, etc. And I think it really depends on the different circumstances of the hotel or a different business. So yeah, the financial factors and also technical support and a lot of different factors would influence the total cost of ownership of the implementation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, a question here by Olivia on anthropomorphism. Yeah, that's a good one. That was actually something I was wondering myself as well. You've mainly manipulated that as a visual appearance or visual identity. But what about other aspects like tone of voice or other features that could make your chatbot or your AI application more anthropomorphic?
Yeah, actually, we have found there are actually two different variables which is related to anthropomorphism. We have animacy and I believe perceived intelligence. So as Olivia mentioned here, that voice and the visual identity and other features, I think can be explained by the variable animacy. So how this robot is designed in a vivid way, and how it would adapt to different situations where people believe that, oh, that's what an actual human would behave. And these are also very important. However, as we haven't had too much time to delve into deeper on these different perspectives, and we believe that, yeah, there are definitely something related to this. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Rufai. The good news is actually that we're going to delve deeper into this, this topic of anthropomorphism, and particularly anthropomorphism also in communication behavior later during the session. But for now, also with an eye to the time, I would like to thank you very much for your contribution. Of course, feel free to stay around and to contribute to the discussion whenever you feel the need to. So one thing I was curious about, because as I said, when I looked at the list of participants, I could see that there was quite a few people there who were either working as IT consultants or developers, but also people from companies. So I'm just wondering, and this is just a first question to hopefully get some discussion going as well. Who of the participants has a concrete experience to share with implementing a chatbot or maybe even multiple chatbots in their organization? If you have that, please either raise your hand or type it in the chat if you will. Okay, I see Olivia and Abdul Kadir. You seem to be from the same organization as well. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Could you briefly tell us about your experiences with implementing the chatbot? Is it successful? Is it being used? What sort of barriers are you experiencing?
So we are both virtual assistant content specialists, two different, so Dutch and French markets. And our chatbots are quite young, actually. We started with this project last year in May. We can say that for now it's quite successful, as we've seen a fast growth in the satisfaction and just in the quality level of the conversations of the chatbot. Still, of course, we do have quite a lot of users who complain about not wanting to talk to a chatbot, for example, most of them probably being older users, as you've mentioned before. So we do have quite a few challenges, but overall, we're quite satisfied with the experience. Yeah.
Okay. And what business are you in exactly?
So we work for H&M Group Retail.
Okay. Yes. So fashion industry or fashion retail, I would say then.
Exactly.
Yeah. And do you have, so you say that the level of satisfaction and the conversation quality seems to be increasing. Do you have any concrete plans as to how you're going to further improve, or are you just going to continue this and evaluate it at some later point?
Yes, indeed. So we are constantly, so we've entered a phase of optimization of our chatbots, and we're constantly looking for ways to improve this in different, with different methods for both our markets, but still constantly making content updates. So process updates, of course, but also just user journey optimization updates. And yes, hopefully increasing the CSAT, also add in additional features such as APIs. So yes, constant improvements.
Mm-hmm. And where in the communication process are you now implementing these chatbots? So what can people use them for already?
Mostly frequently asked questions. We still, we are still at a rather young phase, as I said, but we just started with the implementation of an API that allows customers, for example, to track their orders, so their parcels within the delivery process. This has been a really positive experience for us because we've seen a very big increase in the customer satisfaction since we've implemented this API. So yes, this is as far as we are now, but we're looking into new APIs in the future to to make our services some more performant.
Okay, so you're actually now adding to the list of topics and questions that people can address to the chatbots in a step-by-step fashion. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. I think there's a question here with regard to what you were saying. So what was the high-level timeframe from the decision to implement till the go live for clients? So that's also about the process of implementing. Do you have an idea about that?
None of us are project managers. We are only content specialists, so I couldn't tell you exactly. However, there are other H&M members here in the meeting. Maybe one of them has the answer. I don't have it. I'm sorry.
Okay. So I also saw that. Okay, Jeroen has experience with that. Could you elaborate, Jeroen?
Yeah, regarding the question of Rick on what was your high-level time frame from the decision to implement till the go live for clients. I have experience in building from the very first get-go, so user testing, all the way up to implementing a hotel mail bot for the Postillon Hotel Group. And this took about, I think, a year and a few months for a first real life go-to market. The biggest challenge being natural language processing. So this is not a chatbot, this is a mail bot, right? It analyzes what email comes in, and then the mailbot, the AI, will then answer the question to the customer. Funny thing though there is that when it comes to responding to a customer question, and this was for hotel not room reservations, not F&B reservations, but meeting reservations, meeting and congresses, that when a chatbot answers the question, right? So for instance, I need a room for 500 people and we need lunch, etc., that the initial thought was we're going to decrease the reservation costs, right? All these full-time equivalent people over 17 working for the hotel, just answering questions every day, answering over 10,000 emails. So there's a lot of room for human error there. We thought, okay, by implementing this mail bot, we could decrease the costs while simultaneously sort of improve the customer experience, the guest experience for the hotel. The funny thing there was that if the chatbot makes a slight mistake in things we never even thought about, like the name of a person, the experience goes down. So the chatbot needs to know that good morning is a greeting and not a name, but it would answer back, dear Mr. Good Morning, thinking it was the name of the person, right? This would decrease sales. However, if you do major screw-ups, as in the number of participants, with dear Mr. Such and such, so this is an okay answer, we have reserved a room for 400 people for you. In normal life, you would say, haven't you been listening? I asked for 500 people. This didn't matter so much to the persons. It's the little nitty-gritty things. And those are the things that are really hard to implement when building robots.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for your contribution. I think it really highlights also the importance of the little communicative behaviors in order to get it right. And we'll actually come back to the name issue later. I was wondering, Rick, because you asked that question, did it answer your question? Do you have a
short
better
answer?
idea?
Little over a year.
Yeah. Okay. I also saw that Remco indicated that he had some experience at a previous job. So maybe Remco, if you could you elaborate a bit, tell us, the industry, the context, and the experiences.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I worked for CX company. They work from Maastricht to implement chatbots for several companies. And yeah, I've worked there on the content part, creating the link between the questions from customers to the related answers. And yeah, from that experience, I saw that we always started with a small base. And we also explained to customers we're going to grow and learn in the first month, since we do not know what questions will be asked. And yeah, we always started from at that point, and then we grew very fast in the first couple of weeks, the first month. And that's how we grew the chatbots into a more let's say human-like form.
Mm-hmm.
Just see how people react. We ask for feedback.
So that you got a lot of that feedback in the first month, and after that, did you also conduct, let's say, regular evaluations, or were you involved even at that stage? Or was
yes,
that...
I was primarily doing that every week, seeing how are the questions rated. Did people get the answer they were looking for? We could follow people back then. There weren't that strict rules about privacy back then. So we could follow to see what follow-up questions they would ask. And at that time, we saw that we could not answer the personal questions yet, because we would have to log on to the My environments. In that case, it would be Mijn KPN. And that's what people were looking for back then. How big is my invoice? How much megabyte can I still use this month? That sort of questions. But we couldn't do that because that was too complicated at that time. But we did see that also with other clients back there, that people do want and do need very personal information about their invoices, their information, their tickets, etc.
Yeah, so that's also, I think, something that Olivia was talking about earlier. Adding these kind of functionalities, let's say, to the abilities of the chatbot. So I think we have already like two challenges pointed out. That was Jeroen saying, okay, there's an NLP issue, there's little communicative subtleties that are not always going well. And on the other hand, we also have like the expectations that users have of, okay, what sort of questions can I address and how personalized can the chatbot then or help me in resolving that. Okay, Mechthild says, learning by doing to build a nice conversation. Mechthild, could you elaborate on what a nice conversation is for you at KVK?
Hi. We built a chatbot to catch up with the entrepreneurs who want to know more about the, how do you call it, the programs the government has to support them in the Corona episode. So we made a Corona chatbot. And we had to build it very fast, of course, because we didn't expect this to happen. But we also made a chatbot that could be give over the conversation to a live employee. So at first you can give very fast some answers to the entrepreneurs about and ask some questions about what kind of company they have, and to make some kind of give them some insights about the different programs they can use, and then give more precise information after a few answers and questions they happen to see in the chatbot. And then if they wanted more information, then they could get in touch with the employee. And that helped very much in and gave the employee more insights if they get this conversation in their at their how do you call it, screen. So it saves time. They know already something about the client.
Yeah, but did the clients also appreciate it, that they understand the fact that they were first being asked to talk to a chatbot rather than a live human being? Because this was also something that I think Olivia was saying is difficult for or not quite acceptable for some users.
No, we just say we are a chatbot. Okay. This is a chatbot of the Chamber of Commerce, so they know it's a chatbot, but it helps them to know that not every company is the same. So we just figured out what are the best questions to ask them. This is the same if you have them on the telephone. You want to know, are you a farmer or are you a retail company, or are you self-employed, or do you have a big company? It's are the same questions you ask if you are an employee. So it's not something special or something. Okay. But they really want to know if they are talking to a human being or if they are talking to a chatbot.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Joost asks a question on, maybe Joost, could you elaborate a bit? Human customer attention or care, is it not relevant anymore?
Yes, that was my question. I think I realize in case of spare time, of tijd besparen. I realize that what I is human customer attention care as customer value not relevant anymore, or is it effective in a different way? No, my English is not so well, I believe. I can explain.
Yeah, no, I think from what I understand, you're asking, are we going to put more emphasis on efficiency and time saving and cost saving, or should we invest in making sure that human employees are available because they are able to provide perhaps better service or can be a bit more responsive to what the customer actually needs. Is that correct summary of the question?
Yeah, I still believe that customer attention or customer care is important, but I see with chatbots that's bespaart tijd, save time, save time. But I can imagine that still it's important to inzetten of human customer attention is important on other moment.
Yeah, I think that also corresponds with some of the findings that Stella and Rufai were presenting earlier, where people said, okay, if I want to enter that hotel, I want to be greeted by a human employee, and maybe in different stages of the customer journey, AI can be a useful addition, but it will certainly not replace the human entirely. And it's really up to all of us to think about, okay, what are the processes, the circumstances that allow us to use these chatbots, and where do we really need to make sure that there's enough attention and care for the customer. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks for the contribution. I'm looking also at the time, and I would like to propose there's another brainstorm session later where I'm sure we will return to some of the issues raised here. But I propose that for now, what we're going to do is take a short break, 5-minute break, so everyone can refill their cups, their glasses, or whatever they would need to do at this stage. And we will meet again at 11:10 for the continuation of the session. So thanks so much for your attention and contribution so far. And after the break, I will do a presentation that focuses on human communicative behavior and its effect in conversational agents. And then we'll do a brainstorm. So thanks, and see you in a few minutes. Okay, welcome back again. Hopefully everyone has had a little bit of time to refresh and is ready for the second part of this this online session. As I said, the first thing I will do is give a presentation on some of our research findings. And after that, there will be time for a brainstorm, also again, using your input already from the previous discussion. And I saw also that Oscar had added an interesting insight to the chat just before the break. We're going to use that together to come up with some, let's say, first steps, some ideas to explore further to take chatbots for your organization to the next level. Before I start the presentation, I would like to ask you to, in order to prepare for the brainstorm, and this is something you can do, on the basis of the presentation, the previous one, the group discussion, to please write down some of the ideas that you have or that you got during the session that, in your view, are very relevant to discuss if we want to take chatbots one step further. So in order to prepare for that brainstorm, and as I said, it could be something that you heard in the presentations, it could be something that you heard in the discussion, it could be something that you know from your own experience or from other sources. But just to make it a fruitful discussion later on, write it down already, and then we'll make an inventory later on. What I'm going to talk about is actually a literature review that was conducted by PhD student Michelle van Pinkster at our research center, and that actually last week appeared in print, or actually in digital form, in the Journal of Service Management, and we will share the article with you later as well. But now I'm just going to take about 15 to 20 minutes to present you some of the highlights, and I think it links quite well to some of the things that were said earlier about anthropomorphism, about human-like communicative behaviors versus technical possibilities. And before we start, let's say the conceptual, I don't want to make this too theoretical, but the conceptual foundation on which this study was built was that, if you think about interactions between customers and service agents, whether they're human or non-human, this is, let's say, more or less the chain of events that happen. So the service agent displays certain communicative behaviors, which then causes the customer to, let's say, build a certain perception of that service agent. And that perception can be measured also in terms of likability, friendliness, helpfulness, competence, warmth, politeness, and many more different things. And these perceptions are then used, mentally by the customer to get an insight into, let's say, the quality of the relationship between the service provider and the customer. So do I trust this company? Do I feel a certain liking? Do I feel emotional closeness? Do I feel rapport with the service agent? And then, in the next step in the causal chain, that's really what determines people's satisfaction and also their intention to use a service again, to talk about it to other people, and to cooperate with the company. This has been investigated elaborately in the context of human-to-human encounters, but we have good reasons, of course, to assume that this also works if you're speaking to a chatbot or another type of conversational AI, and that has to do with the phenomenon that was already also mentioned by Stella and Rufai, anthropomorphism. So what anthropomorphism is, very briefly, the human tendency to assign human capabilities, such as rational thoughts and feelings, to inanimate objects. And anthropomorphism is the reason why when we look at this electricity plug, we see more than an electricity plug. We tend to see something that resembles a face. And it's not just a face that we see, but we also have an idea of the feelings that this face might be experiencing. So this face is shocked or surprised or concerned, but not necessarily happy or relaxed or at ease. And of course, it's an electricity plug, so it's fairly irrational to think in these terms, but people still do it. And the disadvantage of this is also that, if you talk about human-computer interaction, people often react fairly irrationally to their computers because they assume that there's a certain degree of rationality and intentionality on the other side. So when people start swearing at their computers, you know it's anthropomorphism at work. But computers do not actually have the intention of making our lives miserable. So it's not much use to scream at them, to swear at them, or to destroy them, as you can see in this video. So what we investigated in this study and this literature review was, okay, which studies, previous studies, have already looked at the implementation of human-like communicative behavior in chatbots, and what were their findings? Because what we found was that actually quite a lot has already been investigated, but most of these findings are not really yet known. They're also spread across disciplines, and sometimes the results are also let's say not all that straightforward, but we'll come back to that later. So a very simple thing that you could ask your chatbot to do, or that you could program your chatbot to do, I should say, is something that Jeroen also referred to earlier, is occasionally using the customer's first name, and then of course doing that correctly. And an example of a fairly early study, 2007, that did this, what they actually found was that a chatbot that uses the customer's first name about, I think, 4 times during a conversation is perceived as more skilled, more human, more engaging, more thoughtful, more polite, and more responsive. And not all of these differences are very large. Some of them are not even statistically significant, but you do see that, sometimes by tweaking very, minor things in the conversation, you can change really the perception of the user in a positive way. And for example, skilled here, there is a statistically significant difference. So you could think, why does making a first name make you look more skilled? That's again a mental process, but you do see that it also happens in a chatbot. Another fairly simple thing is also something that we as humans do regularly when we're having a conversation that we enjoy, is including social praise. So Kaptein and colleagues in 2011 investigated whether it made a difference when a chatbot occasionally used, I think once or twice in a conversation, sentences like the ones that are on the screen right now. So I really like the conversation, you're such kind, I like talking to you. And it may sound, again, a bit strange, to have a computer say that at you, but what they did find was that the praise condition, so the condition in which these utterances were included in the conversation, led to a higher perceived friendliness of the chatbot, which in this case was named Sarah. So again, that's something that's not really hard to do, which could really have an effect on the perception of the service agent. Humor is another thing that we routinely try to do to include in our conversation. It's also, of course, fairly tricky because humor is personal and humor is, culturally speaking, quite sensitive, right? So what's considered appropriate in humor depends on many different circumstances, personal, cultural, contextual. But it's still, it has been investigated in the context of travel or a virtual travel guide in Singapore, I believe, in this study by Niculescu and Banks. And again, most of these studies were experimental in nature. So what you can see is that multiple versions of the same chatbot are created. They exhibit different behaviors, and then you can see the effect of that on the user. So here you see contrasting the answers that Tyra, the non-humorous version, would give compared to, again, Sarah. There's something with female names in chatbot research. I don't know why. But also what Sarah would say, and you could see that Sarah's responses were, let's say, a bit more witty, and you can argue, is that humor, is it not? But what they did find was that Sarah, a conversation with Sarah was indicated by the users who tested her to be more engaging than a conversation with Tyra. And since customer engagement was explicitly mentioned also earlier today as an important reason for trying to invest in chatbots anyway, this I do think is a fairly significant finding. But something else that was significant here was also that some of the users indicated that they liked the humorous version better, but they could also imagine that others might not feel the exact same way. And this is something, the differences between different users that has also been addressed by some studies. For example, Derek and Ligam, they looked at self-presentation techniques. They created 4 versions of the same chatbot, and they really found differences between male participants in their study and female participants. And you can see that in the graph, and there's more to be said, but with respect to the time, I'll limit it to this. But you can see that the females were more fond of the instructions version and the self-promotion versions than the male participants. So gender seems to make a difference. What can also make a difference, and this is actually a bit more subtle, you could say, is the relationship orientation of the user. So in the service literature, a distinction is made between customers who have, let's say, a more relational orientation towards service providers, which means that they tend to be more loyal. They want to, let's say, have ongoing interaction with that company, and they want to also feel that the company values them, versus customers who take, let's say, a more utilitarian approach, or more transaction-oriented rather than interaction-oriented. And we say, okay, I have a need, you have a service that can fulfill that need, and I'm willing to pay for that, and that's about as far as our relationship goes. And this is really something, you could say it's a personality characteristic, but it also affects, and that's what this study by Lee et al. Showed, it also affects how we react to certain communicative behaviors that are used. In this case, I think it was a robot, but it's still a conversational AI. So the users who scored high on the relational orientation valued an apology more than an offer of compensation by the robot. Whereas users who had, let's say, a more utilitarian orientation actually valued the compensation more than the apology. And that's something that's quite interesting, I think, at least from my perspective, because it's also a pattern that you see in research on, let's say, human-to-human service encounters. Now, of course, something that they also pointed out was that it's quite difficult to know beforehand whether, someone who starts to talk to your chatbot is more relationship-oriented or more utilitarian. But they did find already in their study, although it was not really the purpose, they did find an indication that the communicative behavior of the user can provide at least some insight into their relationship orientation. So what they saw was that people who greeted the chatbot, before they started the conversation, and greeted it by saying hello, also scored higher on relational orientation. So in the conversation itself, there also seems to be information available that you can use to see, okay, which communicative approach will work better for this particular customer. And that's, as far as I'm concerned also, but we can discuss that later as well, one of the things we need to look into if we want to further enhance the abilities of chatbots. Now, another thing, of course, to notice is that there are certain trade-offs that are associated with implementing these human-like communicative behaviors. There's the issue of raised expectations. I think that comes back to something that Rufai was saying earlier about, let's say, the perceived intelligence. So if your chatbot is conversationally speaking very proficient, so it does all of these nice little things that humans also do, people also raise their expectations of the level of service that it can provide. And that's, of course, not always the same thing. And that, if these expectations are then not met, that could lead to additional disappointment. And that's also explained by, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but by the uncanny valley theory that says that, if you make inanimate objects more human-like, then usually that leads to, or most of the time that leads to a more positive empathic response up to a certain point where some aspects become too realistic and do not align with the expectations that we have anymore. So that's the idea of the uncanny valley, where you say, okay, if you mimic human behavior too much, then it might actually have a negative effect, unless, of course, it matches the real person, the real human in every aspect. But that's, of course, a stage that we're currently not yet at. Another thing that was found was, and I'm slowly getting to the end here, was that the nice communicative gimmicks that were introduced sometimes also led to a decreased task performance. So they also sometimes seem to act as distractions rather than enhancements of the chatbot user experience. And that is why, and that's actually the final thing that I'm going to say in this presentation, that is why this research suggests that getting to know your user is pivotal. And of course, you do that beforehand by looking at the demographics, the difference between age groups, the different expectations, the things that were mentioned also earlier in the discussion. Okay, what sort of questions would people like to address to the chatbot, and how can we make sure that these questions can be answered? And that's all of insights that you need to gather beforehand, or maybe in the early testing phases, but also getting to know the user during the conversation. So getting to know them in terms of, okay, what sort of communication style do they like? How do they value certain communicative behaviors that you can implement in these chatbots? And that's, let's say, a more dynamic approach where we, as the study by Leah all suggested, just by the way that people greet the chatbot, you can get information about the sort of conversation they would like to have. And if you can get that right, and it's not to say that it's always going to be easy, then that could really help in taking that chatbot and any other type of conversational AI to the next level. Okay. Thanks for your attention. I'm wondering whether at this stage there are questions or comments related to the presentation. So you can type something in the chat, or you can raise your hand. So no questions. Okay. In that case, I would suggest that we continue with the start of the brainstorm, and this is what I asked you to do beforehand, to write down some ideas that you took away from the session, and then really reflect on that question. How could these ideas, in your view, help in improving the quality of conversations between customers and chatbots? And obviously, you can also take, let's say, your own experiences, as we discussed them earlier today, into account. So I'll give you a minute or so to think about this, and then I'm going to ask some of you to answer the question to hopefully get that discussion going as well. If you wish, you can immediately write them down in the chat as well. Okay, I see a first response in the chat by Abdul Kadir. And if I summarize that correctly, saying, okay, there's actually two things that we need to do. Looking at, okay, where does a chatbot, well, not hurt the customer experience? So where are people happy to talk to a chatbot if it can resolve their problems? And then secondly, the conversational expectations part, which I think was mainly what my presentation was about. So maybe Abdul Kadir, could you tell us, for example, what you are currently doing in this respect, or which of these two you would give preference to, as or consider to be a priority?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, for us, yeah, like Olivia already said, we work for H&M, for the H&M group, so it's all fashion based, all our interactions. For us, we already knew the scope that the customers were, the scope of operation for the chatbot. We knew when the customer needed us, and during the course of, because since it went live, we recognized where they would actually really need to talk to like a real human person. So we already dropped a few of those questions that we could, in the beginning, let the chatbot answer. And so for us, really understanding when we use the chatbot was really important. But because we are a fashion company and because we like to talk to our customers in a specific tone of voice, we really want to make the experience as personal as we can. We also really had to focus on the language part. So knowing like how a majority of our customers would be satisfied that we spoke to them. So I would say the top priority was really the situations, but we cannot let go of the how to converse with the customers.
And are you do you think also that there still might be like a change in the different situations in which people would like to use a chatbot, or do you think that you have now more or less have that clear view, and this is you have that fixed set of questions and issues, or are you looking at to still enlarge that set?
No, I think we're still improving on that, or we're still building on that, because like Olivia also said, we're starting to make the situations more personal, because now we have a tracking system where they can actually follow their parcels and get more specific information. So we've already personalized the situation. So I think like in those specific terms where they actually need specific information that's quite valuable to them. So like parcel information, maybe in the future even payment information or whatever, because it could be more sensitive the way we the situations that we give the customers. And I believe that in those situations, the benefit would be to make it as informative as possible, like more fact-based and more secure, instead of just making it like the conversation should be nice. Of course, it should still go smoothly for them, but depends on the situation really. If the situation is already personal, then you need to be more secure with the customer and maybe more reassuring instead of just making it fun.
Yeah, okay, I think that's a very interesting point, that last one that you make there, saying that also has to do, of course, with the way we communicate with each other as humans, saying, okay, in the beginning stages of that relationship, there are different demands, different expectations, and that also means that you slowly adjust, and that would be great, of course, if chatbots could also do that. But you slowly adjust maybe also the tone of voice, the sort of things that you stress in these conversations. So there's let's say a beginning stage and the follow-up stage and maybe a later stage that also ask for very different requirements on behalf of how the chatbot is communicating communicatively. Yeah, thanks. Is there anyone who would like to react to that suggestion made, or maybe one of the other companies who've already looked at something like this? Okay, so Oscar asked the question, how could a chatbot know more about the person before the conversation starts? And I think Michelle almost inadvertently is already answering part of that question. So maybe Oscar, could you elaborate a bit, and then maybe Michelle can also highlight the main points of her reply.
Sure. So there is this project. There is this sort of paradigm of building web applications called linked data, in which we don't only want to have some information being exchanged about people or places, but also some metadata. So where is this information coming from? And in case of humans, that could be that you as a human have some preferences for your favorite meals and your favorite activities and entertainment. But of course, you don't want this data to be entirely public. You want to only disclose it to certain parties. So there is a project by the creator of World Wide Web called Solid, which is trying to answer this. But this is also in computer science, this is the difficult problem of figuring out how to do this sort of web of meaning. So it's a very general open question. I don't know what a good answer here is. But there is definitely a big technical challenge and also a trade-off between the security of how much information, or rather privacy of how much information is being disclosed, and the quality of the service that we receive and how personalized the service is. So how we handle this balance, I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Michelle, maybe you already wrote down some of those, some of your ideas there. Could you also maybe link them to what Oscar was saying?
Yes, when actually conducting this research, so when conducting this literature research, we saw that really basic characteristics play a really important role when in this personalization of communicative behaviors. So gender, age, affinity with technology, relationship orientation. And I think these things, if you force people to create an account, for example, just like H&M does, then I think these characteristics can be applied to the then conversation that the customer has with the chatbot. So I think a first start would be to apply really simple characteristics and, for example, give people different answers if they are a male or a female, or whether they are 20 years old or maybe 50 years old. So I think this would be a very good starting point to start making these chatbots more personal.
Okay, yeah. So that also has to do indeed with data, not just about conversations, but also the background. I think Jeroen also added saying, okay, getting the data, so the more conversations can engage in, the better it learns. Companies might not have enough conversational data. So I think it's conversational data on the one hand, but also background information about the users. Jeroen, am I right in that interpretation?
Yes, although I think two different things, right? What Oscar is saying is more about the background. So for instance, your chatbot could say, hey, Oscar, thanks for joining this conversation. Is it okay for me to look at your socials? And you click yes, and it looks at your Facebook account, etc., right? Learning that, hey, he's an outdoor guy or whatever. My point is more that, as we are all aware, is that the more data you feed into a chatbot, the better it is able to learn about former conversations, right? But the Twin Peaks organization, as I understood, they've got 3 restaurants or hotels, the Beaumont Hotel, etc., in Maastricht. They obviously do not have hundreds of thousands of conversations. So how could you feed hundreds of thousands of conversations into that chatbot in order for it to learn better? How about all these SMEs or small companies, right? MKB-bedrijven. How about they all join together, led by the hotel school or the Brightlands Smart Services Campus, allowing them to just harvest all this conversational data? Question mark.
Yeah, so that's really the suggestion to say, okay, particularly let's say for the smaller companies, pooling data could be really a step that needs to be taken before we can start, let's say, to expect real advances there. I'm wondering, because I think we have representatives from some companies here as well. do they find, is this only for SMEs an issue, or is it also for the larger companies a challenge to find sufficient training data? So I don't know whether there's anyone in the session who could reflect on that, from their company's perspective.
Well, maybe I can then.
Yeah, please.
I've spoken to a lot of companies in what does your user really need, or what's he or she looking for, right? And a lot of the times we hear that, well, we'd like to have this chatbot in order to better engage with our customers, but the type of industry that we are in, we cannot afford screw-ups, right? It has to be first time right. So Harry's was the example earlier in the session. Harry's is a great restaurant, right, in Maastricht, and I think that their customers are looking for a great experience throughout the whole customer journey. So if that at the beginning of your customer journey, that chatbot gets all sorts of things wrong, it sort of dilutes your Harry's experience.
Mm-hmm.
And how companies are afraid for that? It needs to be a first time right.
Yeah. No, I think that's and it's all rightly so, and particularly, of course, it also depends on the brand image. I think that was something I said earlier by Abdul Qadir for H&M and Olivia as well. So I'm wondering, are there any other companies who are also feeling this? Saying, okay, if we want to do this, we need to get this first time right, and we cannot afford, as has been suggested earlier in the session, to say, okay, we're going to take a month or 2 months to gradually build up, the knowledge, the training data that we need. Or is this something that you could maybe do in the background? I'm not sure. What are the experiences there?
Maybe I can share something here. We recently tested a voice assistant in life sciences industry, where the goal is to have the voice assistant narrating the work that the lab researcher is doing, so that he can do it hands-free without needing to write anything on paper or on his computer. And we found out that if the AI responds something to the scientist that makes little sense, scientists are kind of, they have a low threshold for stupidity, to put it not mildly. So they will immediately lose interest in using the solution if the solution does something stupid. Because that raises a lot of doubt. So this goes very much in line with what Jeroen is saying. If the user experience is not on the spot in the very first steps, the user perceives it completely differently, and that's not the point, right? It can be like this.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Olivia, I also see you raise your hand, so you might want to add on to this.
Exactly. Actually, I would say that, of course, it's really nice to be able to deliver excellent service right at the beginning. But from our experience working with machine learning, I think it means that everything is based on trial and error. And yeah, your bot will make mistakes, especially in the beginning. This is inevitable. Of course, you can provide your content with as many training sentences as you can, and this will help a lot, but there will be mistakes. And I think what Michelle said, I think it was a really good point, that you need to make sure to have a plan B. It's really crucial, especially in the beginning of the development phase. So for example, in our case, quickly redirecting the customer towards a live agent when the bot isn't able to provide a satisfactory answer, that's a game changer for the customer satisfaction. So it's all right to make mistakes, and then it's up to you to have, to be really close to your content and read conversations as much as you can and just adapt to that. But just make sure that you have a plan B and that you're able to help customers anyway if the chatbot isn't capable to do so right at that moment.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I think that's, I'm hearing, different things. As I said, there's a few recurrent themes. But before we continue with the discussion and slowly start to move towards a conclusion, I've heard different things being mentioned. I've heard training data being an issue. I've heard customer expectations or fear of damage to the brand image as an issue. I've heard also, I think, the argument of saying, okay, if you need to start somewhere, and many customer groups are forgiving of certain mistakes. So I would just like to ask everyone who's in the session to react, and I'm just going to go back a few slides to a multiple choice question here, just to see what the main ideas currently are. So for everyone, could you please type 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat to indicate with which of the following answering options you agree most. And this is also to test whether we've now covered the most important things. And of course, you can see you can really see whether you agree with one of the answering options or you have something else. So what is the main barrier to, in your view, or in your perception, or in your experience, to the successful implementation of chatbots? And I've provided 3 fixed options: the high initial investment, the lack of training data, and the inability to have actual conversations. We've talked earlier about frequently asked question types, and also the Corona chatbot was mentioned at a certain point. And then, of course, if you think it's something else, or if you think it's a combination, then I would say choose option number 4 there. So I'm just going to wait for a minute or so as you indicate in the chat by typing 1, 2, 3, or 4 to find out what you think the main barriers are. There are already a few responses, but I'm hoping to see more. Okay, I see at least all the answering options are chosen by some people. So Oscar is highlighting the training data, I think. Quality of the conversations. Okay, so that's 4 or 3, maybe somewhere in between. Jeroen is talking about the insecurity. I assume that's also the insecurity on behalf of the companies who are thinking about this. The investment costs are mentioned, and Emil and Casper are also mentioning their inability to have actual conversations. So maybe either Emil or Casper, could you elaborate a bit on this?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can elaborate.
Okay, so Casper maybe first, and then Emil.
All right. I think that even Google and Apple, for instance, who have high investment capabilities and a lot of training data, are still not able to provide you these actual conversations. So yeah, you can have a small conversation, but it's still limited in detail, in my opinion. So I think it comes down to the 3rd option, but that's my opinion.
Okay, Emil, you also chose that same option?
Yeah. For me, it's if you actually look at how an actual conversation consists, it's usually it works in pairs, like a beginning and a closing, and you can expand those things. At this moment, we don't have it in chatbots yet. I'm working in voice, so in voice you have open input, which makes this even harder. And people ask, oh, but what do you mean? Why do you need to know that? This is private information. And as long as you cannot handle that in expanded steps, you cannot have a conversation. And I guess you need a high investment for that, and you need trainings data for that. But in the end, you need to make a conversation. That's it.
So it's also then, if I understand your response correctly, it's also an issue of increasing, let's say, the trust level, so that people are more willing to share that information that can then help you build, better conversations and therefore better service with them. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's part of a conversation. We're now actually looking into a system to build like experience points. So when a person comes in for the first time, the experience points is 0, and slowly, if he answers certain questions, it will go up by 1, by 2, and this way, basically seeing a trust level. If somebody is at level 3 or 4, you can ask different questions than if somebody is at level 1. Mm-hmm. So this makes a whole different kind of conversation.
Yeah, okay, so that's also another way of focusing, let's say, on the information that you get during the conversation and making sure that it's then adapted towards, this particular customer and this, their specific request and their trust level. So yeah. I think that also comes back to something that Michelle was saying earlier, saying, okay, so what sort of insights can we get from the conversation itself? And then we can use these insights in different ways. We can use them, let's say, to improve the communicative behavior or to adapt it better, but also, let's say, to take the conversation or the relationship to a new level, so to speak.
Yeah. So what I see now happening is quite often conversations are built like a tree, more or less, with the branching and this kind of stuff. And with this way, you cannot have a conversation, and you need to rebuild the whole backend system to actually make it happen that you can pull information slowly when you're raising in trust. Yeah.
So then the tree, of course, does not. Well, it has some sort of memory, but it's that's also another thing. Like currently, it's always approached in a step-by-step way. So we have this question, then we have this response, this question, this response, but. Let's say the more natural way, of course, for us as humans to converse is also to know what happened 2 minutes ago and what a person said then, and then incorporate that subconsciously into that conversation as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
I was also wondering about Hul's comment. So the quality is below par. What needs to be done to improve that quality, or what would be for you? What would be your own version of the Turing test, so to speak? When would the quality be acceptable in your view?
My point of view, I think it would be a good idea if those levels that we talked about a few minutes ago would be implemented, depending on the questions and the answers. That you go up a certain level in the types of conversations, but it also has something to do with the mood I'm in. I'm not always in the mood for talking to a chatbot. Mm-hmm. So most of the time, if I'm not in the mood, if I need a quick answer, and if the problem is a little bit more complicated than a yes or a no, most of the time, and I say, stop, I want to talk to someone. Mm-hmm. And a few of those chatbots really react to this and stop talking and stop asking questions and connect me to a person. It's depending on the mood. Mm-hmm. If I need a quick answer, I'm fine with a chatbot. But if it's a little bit more complicated and you get stupid answers, it's a turn-off for me.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, I think that's very clear, and that's I think another example of also, let's say, this dynamic adaptation ability that they should have, perhaps more than they have now. So this is something I think that's certainly worth of exploration in later stages, as well as of course the issue raised earlier by Jeroen, and then now also stressed or emphasized by Oscar in the chat. Of the training data issue. Okay, it's great fun hearing all of your thoughts and ideas, but it's also 3 minutes to 12, so we're really nearing the end of our session. On behalf of myself, I would really like to thank you for your active participation, for the sharing of ideas. This was a first step, in a prolonged process as we see it now. And this really provided us also with insights. I hope it was useful for you as well, that you learned a few things that that you didn't know before that you can use in your work, in your daily operations, in the further improvement of the chatbot. And thank you very much. And with that, I would like to hand over back to Peter, maybe for some closing words.
Thank you very much, Mark. Very interesting. Yeah, the closing words. I think there were very interesting discussions. Let's take some time to digest this and consider our next steps. I think what would be good if that we share some material, some reference material that was presented today. I think you also have some articles or papers that are describing your research. So let's draft an email together and keep the participants of today informed about the next steps. That what I would like to propose. And then yeah, once again, thank you very much for joining, and hope to see you soon. Cheers all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. See you later. Speak you later.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Definitely. Cheers.